Thank you very much for coming to this session on engagement and how it will help performance in the civil service. My name is Russell Grossman. I'm Director of Communications at BIS, the Department for Business. And in fact, it was the Department for Business that commissioned David MacLeod and Peter Clark in their report Engaging for Success, which was launched in 2009. And in fact, it's been my pleasure to work closely with them since then, and subsequently as part of the Employee Engagement Task Force, which was established with the advocacy of the Prime Minister in March this year. It's actually quite interesting to see that we have quite a number of people here today, and thank you for that. I know that you have a choice. There are, in fact, 9 other sessions running at 3 o'clock. And the really interesting thing is that in the brochure, we only put one line, which basically said, with David MacLeod and Nita Clark of BIS. So that, to me, demonstrates that there's quite clearly a level of interest in the subject of employee engagement. And what I would like people to go away today having had was a greater understanding and also a greater reassurance about the use of employee engagement drivers as a device to improve motivation and productivity in the civil service. This is a difficult time, not just for the civil service, but for the public sector at large. And employee engagement is one of those devices that should be able to help us through this very difficult time. Employee engagement is a very popular topic in the corporate world for raising productivity and competitiveness. We have today on the panel, and I will introduce them individually in just a second, both private and public sector representatives for that particular purpose. So who is on the panel today? And let me explain that I'm going to ask each of the panel members to speak for a few minutes, and then I want absolutely for us to have a good time to have questions and answers and to question the panel on any aspect that you would choose. In the order that we are going to ask them to speak, firstly, David MacLeod at the extreme end of the table here. David is the co-author of the report I mentioned, Engaging for Success. He's also the author of The Extra Mile, How to Engage Your People to Win. He has worked in areas ranging from manufacturing to central government over the last 30 years, and in each of those he's recognised that getting people on board is the key to success. On David's left is Nita Clark, the co-author of the Engaging for Success report. Nita is the director of the Involvement and Participation Association, which is Britain's leading organisation delivering partnership, consultation and employee engagement in the workplace. Nita has been there since January 2008. She actually has had a long career in the trade union and labour movement generally. She was press officer and then political officer for Unison until January 2001 when she joined Downing Street and was in fact Tony Blair's assistant political secretary with responsibility for trade union liaison. At Number 10, she was also directly involved in establishing important social partnerships, including the transposition of the Information and Consultation Directive and Women at Work Commission. And both David and Nita are very much in demand as motivational speakers on employee engagement and on positive employee relations. I think it's fair to say that since the Engaging for Success report was published, they have both acquired international guru status, but they always recognise their original commission from government. To the left of Nita is Sue Round. Sue is the Director of Learning and Development, Engagement and Talent at British Gas. She started her working life at BA, where she developed a passion for people development. Since then, she's held a number of senior roles at O2, at Marks & Spencer and at Sainsbury's. And she joined British Gas last year in her current role. She's a judge at the National Training Awards and sits on the Employee Engagement Task Force. And I've particularly asked Sue to look at employee engagement and what works or indeed what doesn't from a private sector perspective. Liz McEwen is the Deputy Director of Analysis and Insight at the Cabinet Office, and she is most particularly the person responsible for the Civil Service People Survey, which I think we've now run for 2 or 3 years. And to my immediate right, Gus O'Donnell, of course, needs no introduction, hopefully, but I think critically here, he is, as head of the civil service, the man responsible and accountable for ensuring that the civil service is equipped with the skills and capability to meet the challenges it faces every day, and that civil servants work in a fair and decent environment. So those are our speakers today. As I say, I've asked them to speak each for a few minutes, and then we will take questions. So David and Nita, over to you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Russell, for the introduction. I was at something the other day, and the speaker said, thank you for that introduction. My father would have enjoyed it, and my mother would have believed it. What Nita and I will do is just briefly touch on, from this year's work we did with BIS, trying to understand what it is that enables engagement in organisations. We'll briefly touch on the 4 things we found, and then we'll say something about the task force itself and maybe opportunities for those interested to be involved. So, the first thing we found in organisations that do this well is they have a strategic narrative. What does that mean? It means there's a story about where the organisation's been, where it is, and where it's going, preferably a bit inspiring. Do you know, and I've got to say, I was really surprised. First 25 years of my career was in the private sector, and I was standing in front of groups on like this and saying, you know, we really should be inspired by shareholder value. I've never met the shareholder, and they'd never met the shareholder. Or we're going to be inspired by being the world's first widget maker of some sort or another. I mean, it was slightly hard work. And I thought, well, this is going to be fantastic now being involved in the public sector, because every meeting will start with a big reminder. We are here to improve the health of the nation, or the life chances of people, or taking depressed areas and make them better places to live in, or the defence of the nation. Every meeting can start with a big reminder of what it is we're trying to do that inspires us and is, in our terms, a sort of strategic narrative that we can relate to. And do you know what most of the meetings started with? The balanced scorecard. Now, I'm not against the balanced scorecard, but that isn't what gets me out of bed in the morning. And I think that if I can encourage you, you have a massive inbuilt opportunity. Whatever the press says, whatever anyone else says, you know why you're in the public sector. You know you have a massive contribution to make. And we found that those who understood that, who reminded themselves of it, were addressing one of these really important strategic enablers. The second thing we found in organisations doing well was that the direct line manager, the person who manages me, does a few basic things well. They don't need to go to Harvard for 2 years. They do some basic things well. The first thing they do is they focus me effectively on what success would look like in the role and give me some scope so I can bring myself to this. I mean, there's parameters, clearly, but give me a bit of scope to bring myself, but I know what success looks like. It's clearly outlined. The second thing these managers do is this. What are the worst 2 words in the management lexicon? Human resources. I am not a human resource. I am a human being. I am not human capital. I am an individual. And those managers who treat their people as human beings, as individuals, who know them, who attend to them, who help them, who address a whole range of different kinds of issues that are to do with me. I feel I'm clocked as a human being. If I'm treated that way, you get more of me. And the last thing that we found was these managers are constantly coaching and stretching their people. 90% of this is giving positive, reinforcing feedback. I guess probably most of us in this room are British, and like a number of you, I've lived abroad. And what strikes you is, you know, in Britain, we've had the gene removed from us all called well done. Thank you. That was great. I mean, how do we say well done in this country? That didn't go quite as badly as I thought it was going to go. Well, actually, most of us, from the most senior to the most junior, we need positive reinforcement. The only other part of this is, of course, we do not walk past dysfunctional behaviour. We address it. We don't bring people in the room and suddenly boof them in the eye, but we don't walk past behaviours and attitudes and work practices that get in the way. We address those and help people to do it. So those are 2 things that we found present in the organisations doing it well.
Again, Russell, thank you very much. At least you didn't do what somebody did the other day. They introduced David and me as the Simon and Garfunkel of employee engagement. And somebody who was clearly quite disgruntled said from the back, I don't know about Simon and Garfunkel, more like Morecambe and Wise. Thereby, of course, leaving open the question of which one of us was the short, fat, hairy one. So, thank you. So, the third thing that we found, and this was incredibly important, was employee voice. organizations that really listen both to the workforce collectively, and that means having your industrial relations well organized as part of your engagement architecture, but actually it's about individuals in the workplace feeling listened to. And the Sunday Times Best Places to Work For found very, very clearly that the thing that most motivated people to appreciate their organization was this sense of feeling listened to. Now, plenty of people say to us, of course we listen, we do a survey. We used to call it an employee opinion survey, and now we call it an employee engagement survey. And we really listen because you should see our comms. Fantastic email cascades, you know, fantastic communication. The point is, of course, are you communicating or are you listening? Now, obviously, communication is very important because actually, if you want the workforce to really play a part and to contribute, they need to have the information that's needed, both to do their jobs, but also to understand the strategic narrative. But this sense of employee voice is absolutely critical. And of course, if you think about it, it's the heart of many of those Japanese techniques like Kaizen is actually the very simple understanding that if you want to know how to do something better, ask the person who's doing it, which is usually a pretty good rule of thumb. The fourth thing that we found, and this was again incredibly important, was we called it integrity. In other words, that the values that the organization espoused were reflected in the behaviors. So you didn't go into somewhere and it had up on the wall, our people are our greatest asset. And actually everybody there knew that there was a culture of bullying and harassment, loads of grievances, and hey presto, they were about to go to industrial tribunal. So this is about keeping it real. This is not about good glossy brochures or corporate spin, because people who work for an organization see through that quicker than anybody else. But this sense of integrity, of values and behaviors working together is really fundamental, because if they don't, you get distrust, and you can't have engagement, in our view, in organizations where there's distrust.
So we offered this, and as we were doing it, and as we were going around trying to share some of these insights that we garnered from, I'm sure, some of you in this room, and certainly on the panel as well, what we tried to do was then listen to how people reacted. And one of the things they said was, we want more practical help. We do not want to paint by numbers, because all our situations are context specific. But we would like to know, well, who does a strategic narrative well? Can we see some? Can we see some video clips? Can we see some written versions of it? Can we understand it? Can we visit organizations that are doing it, for instance? So there was a great desire for more practical help, to share good ideas and good practices so that I can draw from them in grabbing this opportunity and dealing with it back at in the workplace. There was also a great sense from leaders throughout the UK of the need to raise the profile of the topic, because it is unquestionably good for organisations. If it's good for organisations, it's good for the country. And by the way, it's not sustainable unless we also attend to employee well-being. So it's good for the employee, it's good for the organisation, and it's good for the country. And if you've been, for instance, watching some of the programmes, Evan Davis and so on manufacturing, or basically on the economy, and looking at that in a global perspective, you can't help but be reminded that the Chinese and the Indians are not going to be sitting back making suits and call centres and so on. They are moving up the value chain and coming to the wealth-creating part of our country. So we definitely need this because of what's coming. And of course, in a new media age, the way we communicate is very different from the past. So in a nutshell, we have launched a government-sponsored but employer-led task force. Has some very senior sponsors on it, including, I'm delighted to say, Gus, and senior leaders, senior chief executives from across the UK, as I think of in these pieces of paper you might have picked up as you came in. So that's the raw material, if you like, that we're going to be harnessing in order to try and take the topic forward.
And the task force has met once already and has agreed some focused areas of further work. For example, members of the task force are getting together to look at things like how we can put more flesh on the bones of the 4 enablers that we've talked about, how we can really keep nailing the evidence, because as Gus and others always say to us, never assume that everybody understands this. You've got to keep making the case for why engagement, really does impact on performance, productivity, and indeed profitability. We're going to, the weakest part of our report, I think we would be quite honest and say, was the bit on barriers, about why it doesn't happen, given that so much of this is obvious. why doesn't it happen? There are some very complex reasons why it doesn't happen, but I think that the task force really needs to delve down and to get, to really get to some of those. And there are other areas as well. But the task force is also going to be looking at what practical support. So we are garnering case studies from big, small, medium organizations, public, private, third sector, looking at what good looks like, because as David said, there is no one model of this. We're also, our big aim is to set up an open access engagement website on which you will have case studies, on which there will be guides to how to do, but also, more importantly, it'll be interactive, so that if you're working in a SME in Manchester and you've got a problem, how do you get your boss to really get this? You can go on there and there'll be a community there that'll say, well, actually, this is how we did it. You might want to try this, or this is something that works particularly well in the SME sector. So there's a tremendous amount of work that the task force is going to be doing. The other thing we've set up, and hopefully there will be people here who will relate to this, is a practitioners group where we are bringing together people who are both doing engagement and people who are sort of on the journey, but people who are starting on the journey. So it will be both a learning experience for people, but also it's incredibly important that we garner the evidence about what people are doing out there, but how people are feeling and what the challenges are for people actually doing engagement. And again, these practitioners would be private, public, and third sector. And we've got the first meeting of that, I think it's Friday week. There's so many people, there's over 150 that we're now sort of holding two sessions of it. So it's an incredibly exciting prospect that if we can, as David always says, this is a movement. It's not it's not a Gantt chart. It's not it's something that really needs to tap in, to how people are feeling about how to move forward at work. And I think that we've been incredibly lucky to have been given the opportunity first to do the first report and then asked to be carrying on doing it.
So thank you very much for that. Huge passion there, huge engagement with the topic, and we've heard that it's good for the organisation that it's in, it's good for the economy, it's good for the country. Sue, as a practitioner in HR and engagement and learning, what's the perspective from your point of view, particularly given that British Gas is obviously in the private sector?
Absolutely, and without corporate spin, I promise. As you know, I've worked for 4 FTSE 100 companies. They are BA, M&S, Sainsbury's, and now British Gas. And I think they are not as different as it would first appear, because they all have a clarity of purpose, I think, in terms of selling products and services directly to customers, and all have had to adapt their businesses as the world has changed around them, and with varying degrees of success, take their people with them on those journeys. So possibly not coincidentally that as the pace of change accelerates around us, interest in employee engagement has grown. The increase in focus reminds me of the rise of the concept of corporate responsibility. All good companies now wear their good citizen credentials on their sleeves because customers are very choosy about where they spend their money and are much less tolerant of questionable people and planet practices. Customers want to buy from companies, I think, that treat their employees well. The employee deal should be perceived as fair both inside the company and externally to customers. What I also think is true is that engaged employees are more productive and give willingly of their best efforts. I think we all know that, we all get that, but sometimes in the heat of battle, it's difficult to remember that. In the businesses I've worked in, great services delivered by those with pride in what they do who feel valued by their employers. Service levels can drop very quickly if the corporate eye is taken off the people agenda. I'm sure we've all suffered at the hands of a disgruntled employee at the supermarket checkout or on board an aircraft, vowed never to use their services again. In a world of cutthroat competition, businesses simply cannot afford to lose customers. So, employee engagement is emerging as a corporate competence, bringing with it an industry of measurement. It is, of course, critical to understand how employees are feeling, for employees to be listened to and to feel heard, as Nita has already said. In large, geographically disparate organisations, it is very difficult to read the mood without some form of organised data gathering. However, I think it's important that measurement doesn't become an end in itself. The annual jostling for position in the best companies list stirs the competitive spirit of CEOs in my experience. However, this should only be the starting point for activity and not an end in itself. I often quote Andrew Templeman at the Cabinet Office, who said, "You don't make a pig fat by weighing it. You have, of course, to feed it too." At British Gas this year, we're not completing a large company-wide survey in order to create the space to put some actions in place around the last data gathering exercise and to think through our overall strategy. It seemed that we were constantly asking people the same questions, then doing some action planning, but not actually moving to action. And then lo and behold, it was time to do another survey again. This has been controversial, actually. So I'm relatively new in tenure, and this has been kind of the first big decision that I've made. And I think people have interpreted this as, oh, so we're not doing engagement this year then, you know, as if I'm on strike. But this data-free zone has enabled us to reflect on what the numbers and the qualitative information were really telling us, and then to shape, articulate, and begin to share our overarching strategy and demonstrate where a central engagement team can really add value beyond gathering data. We were in danger of becoming number crunchers, or worse still, a department that bears the responsibility for engagement, allowing line managers to abdicate theirs. As a way of articulating our strategy, we have found that Nita and David's 4 enablers are a really useful, practical framework. When I first looked at them, I thought, oh, you know, is this kind of really academic stuff? But when you dig down underneath, you can find a way that you can apply this in your business and in your organisations. The strategic narrative is absolutely key. Surely it's important for us all to connect with a purpose. It is the why do I get out of bed question. But I think also we need to be able to identify our contribution very clearly to that strategic purpose. Our engineers, on a daily basis, are able to recognise the impact their work has in customers' homes, fixing boilers and heating systems, and they describe the moment when they hear the engine running of the boiler again and the radiators warming up. It's really satisfying for them. And I think that our purpose as managers is to make it easy for frontline employees to do a great job and not get in their way, which is what we often do. We also need to help them to understand how they contribute to the company's success and to help them to feel rewarded for that contribution. So absolute clarity between organisational direction, individual objectives and reward. In a supermarket environment, colleagues who connect with their customers are able to make the link with their actions and the company's performance and share in that success are the most engaged and productive in my experience. Great store management is an enabler of that virtuous circle. Sainsbury's head office is very deliberately called the Store Support Centre because that is what it is there for. It's not an ivory tower for people to feel good about themselves. It is there to support activity in stores. And to reinforce that, every year, sometimes kicking and screaming, office-based managers are sent out into stores to work alongside their colleagues and reconnect them with that purpose. During my time at British Airways, I observed a roller coaster of engagement. When I first joined the business a very long time ago, it was still nationalised, which dates me horribly, and the concept of competition was an anathema. There was no competition. There was kind of vaguely British Caledonian lurking somewhere. And the focus on service, I think it's fair to say, was not a top priority. The arrival of Colin Marshall, I think, marked the dawning of a new era. Clarity of purpose, an emphasis on the importance of our passengers, effective communication channels, and management who are committed to enabling that vision, and leading-edge profit-sharing schemes. The 4 enablers in action, I think, ahead of their time, and I really do hope that British Airways can find its way back there again. You talked about recognition and saying thank you. Last week at British Gas, we held a recognition event, and we had debated whether or not we should continue with it in the current climate, and we're focusing on cutting our costs. It's hard out there in the environment. We've got Ofgem, we've got all sorts of challenges. But we went ahead, and I'm really delighted that we did. It served a dual purpose. First of all, it allowed our best performing colleagues to be recognised for their contribution, and it reminded the management teams how important the front line actually is. The citations that we read out of the heroic efforts, for example, of colleagues walking almost over broken glass to get to our customers last winter, were really inspiring. My managing director was absolutely beaming with pride when he presented the awards, and I know he was energised by the experience with a renewed recognition that engaging his priceless resource in this way is not just about data gathering, but about creating an environment in which great work can be done. And he's an accountant, by the way. So he's a number cruncher by nature, but he absolutely got it. It was written all over his face. And I think the role of the engagement team is to guide businesses on that journey.
So you very clearly advocate the principles that David and Nita have set out in their report, and that's very encouraging. Now, Liz, as someone who works in the Cabinet Office, the civil service equivalent, I suppose, of the Store Support Centre, and responsible for the employee engagement or the people survey. I'm not going to extend the narrative about making a pig fat by weighing it and all of that, but where are we with the people survey?
Thanks, Russell, and I've never quite heard the Cabinet Office described in that way. It's interesting. I have some slides, so brilliant. I wanted to begin with, what do we mean by employee engagement in the civil service? I like to think it's not a woolly concept, and nor do we believe, as others on the panel have said, it's just about the survey, important as the survey is. Nor do I think it's really helpful having a long discussion about how exactly we should define employee engagement. I think employee engagement in that way is a bit like love. We may struggle to agree on a definition, but we always know exactly how it feels when we're in love, and we know how it feels when we're in an engaged environment. And to extend the analogy perhaps to its limits, that buzz, that buzz when you're in love, it's very similar to the buzz you get when you're in an engaged environment at work. Why do we care about engagement in the civil service? Oh, I know. Yes, it may say something about my love life.
It's obviously going really well at the moment.
Yes, exactly. Yes, so why do we care about engagement in the civil service? It's really actually very simple. If we can help every civil servant fulfill their potential at work, then we're going to have better civil service organisations, we're going to have a better civil service, and one that can deliver better public services. But how are we going to do that? Important as I think my team is, we can't do it alone. Important as Gus and the role of his other PermSec chums is, they can't do it alone. And I think it's really important to say up front that actually employee engagement is everyone's responsibility. There's the responsibility of us all to create an environment where we can be engaged, where we can almost feel in love, so to speak, although not literally. If employee engagement is generally important, why is it really important now? I think, there could be a tendency at the moment to think that about employee engagement. It's a difficult, challenging time. Let's just put our head in the sand and not worry about this employee engagement lark until easier times come along when we might have time for it. I think pretty strongly that would be the wrong approach. While I think there's more to engagement in the survey does tell us some really interesting, valuable things. In the last 2 years, one thing that's come out really strongly from the survey, and that's that civil servants don't believe we manage change well in the civil service. Our scores in that area are low, both absolutely and when we compare them to private sector benchmarks. That's not the same for every area of the survey. There's bits of the survey, like how civil servants feel about their work, where we score higher than the private sector. But on managing change, it's a real challenge. And I think it's right that in that area, we can look at some of the best examples from the private sector and see what they've done to manage change really well. And I think 2 things come out here. The first is actually how staff are actively engaged in the change really matters. Are they being involved? Are they being asked for their views? Are we being open and honest with staff about what's happening? The second is actually engaging staff in finding efficiencies. And I think, when we do this in the civil service, it can work really well. Last year, the Spindon Challenge found over 100,000 ideas for eliminating waste and inefficiency in the civil service, many of which are being taken forward now. And it's a great example of when we actually involve people in finding efficiencies, we can have real results. But I'm pretty sure there's more we can be doing in that area. So how are we doing in employee engagement terms so far? Here I'm going to return to the survey briefly, just to have a look. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the questions that we asked for employee engagement in the survey. And on the left-hand side of the screen, some headline results. Now, quite a complicated chart, I know, for late in the afternoon. But basically, this is showing the engagement results for the 100 organisations that take part in the Civil Service People Survey, their results this year and last year. What happened? I think it's worth saying up front that engagement levels vary quite significantly across the civil service. Some organisations have quite significant challenges in this area, while others are particularly high performing. And so the range of engagement levels varies from 34 to 73%. But what happened overall last year? Last year we did the survey at what could be one of the more challenging times to run a survey, just as the Spending Review was announced. Overall, there was a drop in engagement levels, but just by 2 percentage points. And in that period, actually 30 civil service organisations actually saw an increase in their employee engagement levels, which was something that we were very pleased about. But clearly there's room for improvement. So how are we going about improving engagement levels in the civil service? There's lots of ways we are doing so, but I just want to touch on two briefly now. The first is collaboration. We've got 100 civil service organisations participating in the civil service. That's a lot of practitioners, that's a lot of good ideas. We're using that practitioner community to share best practice, to share guides and support materials, and as a peer support network. And we're now using that practitioner network to link up with David and Nita's work and spread that learning across the private and public sector too, and learn from them. So that's great. Because we have one survey across the whole civil service, where organisations have done well in the last year, we've gone to those organisations and we've said, what have you done? What's happened? We've taken what they've said, we've shared it across all the other organisations, and in the interest of transparency, we've also put the information on websites so other organisations outside the civil service can also learn from the same material. Often what was coming out there wasn't rocket science, wasn't a whole range of new techniques. It was actually really focusing down on the basics and making sure that excellent people management was just consistently and relentlessly applied. The other way that we're going about improving engagement levels is accountability and holding leaders to account for engagement in their organisations. We're starting this right at the top, and engagement metrics form part of the Permanent Secretary appraisal process. They form part of the Department's performance metrics, and they're now beginning to filter down further down into organisations as well, which I think is really important. Finally, I said at the beginning that engagement was everyone's responsibility. There's a whole myriad of ways in which that's the case, but there's one little way in which you can help and take away today. We've got our next survey in October. It's a really good point for us to find out how we're doing through what's no doubt is a challenging year for many people. So it would be great if you could take back to your teams, encourage them to fill in the survey, fill it in yourself, because I can assure you that the results are listened to, discussed and acted on at the highest levels. And luckily, you don't have to take my word for that, because I should pass over to Gus.
Thanks very much, Liz. And the survey is out in September, is that correct?
End of September.
End of September.
Yeah.
So, Gus, are we in love, or do we have our head in the sand?
We're completely in love with the concept of engagement. At least I certainly am. And let me explain why. It's not because of a number. It's not because of getting a survey up. It's because what David and Anita referred to is actually it's about what we try and achieve, our end results. You know, when I think about the problems I've got in my in-tray at the moment, how do we avoid a famine in East Africa? You see those pictures. I know we've got staff working at the moment on how do we solve those problems. How do we manage a situation where we've got a lot less money and we're trying to help the most disadvantaged groups in society? If we can't get inspired by all of that, and David's absolutely right, you know, shareholder value, maximize your profits. I mean, I just think those things are quite hard to deliver. When I go back and I think what's really motivated me, there's an interesting point about how we started our lives. Now, Nita and I worked together in Number 10 for Prime Minister Tony Blair, but we had met before. We were both at Warwick University. Now, Nita was incredibly engaged in student politics. I was incredibly engaged in student sport. Right? We were slightly different. That was...
Come on.
We have a mutually assured destruction pact, which is that we'll keep some aspects of our student life where they need to remain. But it just struck me. I went on from there to lecture in economics at University of Glasgow. And one of the most engaged and fulfilling things was to actually teach a class and get across those concepts. And you saw it person to person, right? I had my boiler starting up moment every day when I could get across to somebody and they really finally understood supply and demand. You know, that was just fantastic. Now, the interesting thing is, in the civil service, and it must be the same in a lot of organisations, we are not all there when the boiler starts up. The people who will solve the problem in East Africa are sitting in places in DFID. They're a long way away. You never get that personal satisfaction of seeing the individual. It's one of the reasons why I love getting out and why I actually think we shouldn't be having to persuade our senior staff, why Sainsbury's shouldn't be having to tell them to go to the front line. Getting to the front line is fantastic. When I go and see people, when I go and see services, what you see is us delivering for ultimate customers. That's fantastic. You get great rewards for that. One of the things we need to think about in engagement for us is, what about all those people that make the boiler man actually get that satisfaction? And for us, it's a lot of unsung heroes behind the scenes. So we really need to think about how, as leaders, do we engage all of our staff and get them connected to that real buzz of the final delivery. And I really quite powerfully think we need to do that. So I'm really pleased the celebration event went ahead. We had a fantastic one at Buckingham Palace for the Civil Service Awards. And it's really important we carry on saying thank you. And we will carry on with our Civil Service Awards. Possibly we disagree on the numbers point. I think, you know, there are all sorts of phrases. What you treasure, you measure. You know, and if we measure it, we will treasure it. If we start in difficult times to say, actually, let's not do the survey this year, the results might be a bit embarrassing, that's the end as far as I'm concerned. I'm absolutely passionate that we must just keep engaged with this subject, keep working away and keep asking you. It's one way. You know, there's 500,000 civil servants. It's incredibly hard for me to hear you. I really believe in this, you know, 2 ears, 1 mouth. We should use them in that ratio. We really need to listen to you and to get your ideas and to tell us, is it working? Are we doing things correctly? We put you through incredibly tough times. We've got job cuts. We've got pay freezes. We're changing the pensions world. You know, we need to hear from you. We are trying through these difficult times to keep people engaged, keep that focus on making the best on public service delivery. So I think that's massively important. And it is, the final point I'd say is, it's absolutely all about values, all of this. If you really care, that the points were made there about honesty. Our values are honesty, objectivity, integrity, impartiality. You know, that's what we operate with. If we combine them with showing pace and professionalism in the way we operate and pride and passion about the final outcomes we can deliver, then as a civil service we will not only be the most professional, most respected around the world, we'll also have staff who are massively engaged, and they're engaged because they know they're making a real difference. And that will be a fantastic result for all of us. Thank you.
And that's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, Gus. Well, we do now want to listen from you. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. We've got about 3 roving microphones who've just made themselves known. Thank you for that. If you have a question, obviously you could put your hand up. And I see a lady down here in the purple top.
Hello, I'm Anne Hurst. I work for a Vehicle Operator Services Agency, which is a very small little delivery agency. Part of the trouble, when you mentioned about corporate scorecards, that really chimed with me, because part of the trouble I have is getting people away from the idea that the survey is the end of the process and the beginning. So how can we kind of engage with senior leaders and make them see that this is not just another measure to add to all the many other thousands of measures that they measure, and it's something actually that should be fundamental to how we do things.
Sue, I'm going to ask you to answer this one first, because I think this is something that perhaps the private sector is possibly better at than the public sector.
I think, I mean, I don't want to get the wrong impression about my view on measurement. I think measurement is important, but it's following it up with actions. And I think there is some research to actually say that if you do keep repeating the survey, quite soon after the survey, engagement drops off because people feel actually more aggrieved than they did beforehand, because they don't feel that they've been listened to and their perspective has been acted on. So I think it's publishing the results very honestly and transparently, and also communicating what it is you're doing in response to the survey. So it's that this kind of, you know, you said we did type approach, and I think making those links very clearly for people.
So there's the credibility there. David, would you agree with that?
Well, I'll just say, I mean, to know where you are is kind of important, and it does provide some of the oxygen or fuel of effort. But we've seen some wonderful things happen. One survey, for instance, had 200 managers in a particular part, and they simply found who was engaging their people best. Now, the interesting part was they put the top 50 on the board and said those 50 will help anyone else, and the 150 said, well, I want to be in the 50 next year. So there's a kind of sense of viralness to all this, having explored what the numbers are saying. I think we're all agreeing it's important to measure, but then to get under the number. And I can't say it better than Richard Baker, who's a very impressive guy, I know, talked to all the perm secs. He said, your job is to give your organisation a damn good listening to. And that's a part. Let's use the numbers to root us in the reality. If they've fallen off the cliff, you know, that's the tone of the conversation. If they're a bit better, that's the tone of the conversation. But it isn't about saying just numbers. It's using the numbers to get under the skin. And when your leaders start to take them, people often say, how do you take your leaders to somewhere in a bit of the organisation that's working well with an outcome they'd understand as an accountant, and then get them to touch it, feel it, visit it, and see it. What is that? Your experience, really, seeing the chief executive with the... so get them to see it and touch it. It's passion and proof's what you need. You get passion and proof, your leaders are at it.
Okay. I want to try and get through as many questions as possible. Incidentally, if you'd like a particular panel member to answer, please indicate. I'm going to ask this gentleman in a second, but again, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand so we can be ready. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Graham Henderson, Department of Health, and also a former president of Prospect, which I notice is the only individual trade union which actually sponsors this particular project. In some organisations, employee engagement is sometimes used as a device for circumventing trade unions and established industrial relations procedures, not necessarily from many of the people represented on the top table, but particularly during the type of challenging times that Gus quite rightly described over pay, pensions and job losses. How do you actually see the interaction between employee engagement and trade unions, and what trade unions can actually bring to the table? Thank you.
Gus?
Sure, but I think Nita is equally well qualified to do this given her background. Look, this is one of those many areas where trade unions and all of us are actually got exactly the same agenda. You know, the trade unions are in exactly the same place. They and I'm really glad you're sponsoring this. And the question is, if the others aren't sponsoring it, why aren't they? You're completely right. This is about increasing job satisfaction as much as anything else. You know, I remember my days of lecturing. When you get that point across and you really see the results of your work, that's fantastic. You're engaged. You're motivated. Why else would you work for a university where they're not paying you very much? And actually, no, it was a great job. But you're right, we do need to get that alignment, use the trade unions. It's great to have a positive agenda joint with them, and we're all on exactly the same page in this. It is about engagement, as I think Nietzsche and David both made clear. You know, when you're looking for those new ideas about how do we improve our services, how do we make it better for the public, the place you start is not with some learned paper. It's actually going to visit the people who deal directly with the public, get their ideas, say, what are the things, the obstacles for you doing it better? And it might be their IT system, it might be the policy, which creates something that's very complicated. So you can come back with those ideas and do very well. So engaging with the people that are actually they're working very hard on it is absolutely crucial, and you increase job satisfaction if you allow people more empowerment over how they do their job so they can deliver a better service. They are happier, more engaged, and much more productive.
Nita, does that match the experience you've had from other companies as well?
Yes, I mean, look, let's be clear. I think it's absolutely vital that your industrial relations aligns with your engagement strategies. I mean, I do think that and when they don't, then I think things do become quite complex and complicated, and I would say British Airways, I'm not taking any sides in that dispute, but British Airways spent an absolute arm and a leg on employee engagement, and actually by not aligning the two, you know, I would suggest that they're not maximising the value of that. My personal view is that this should be a no-brainer for trade unions. I mean, it should absolutely be at the forefront. I should say, in fact, USDA are also on the sponsor group, and of course Brendan Barber is on the sponsor group, and Sarah Veal is on the task force from the TUC. So there's no, you know, we are very, very clear that the trade union movement has a very important role to play in this. Look, my view is this. This is about helping people get on at work, and I think that's a vital part of any trade union's job. Trade unions are looking for a role, particularly in the private sector at the moment, a lot, and actually this is, in my view, this is completely it. Now there's still a view among some trade unions. This is about, engagement is about screwing, you know, more out of people for less. Well, if it's that, it's not engagement. I mean, it's something else. I mean, we're just really clear about that. And I spend a lot of time strongly encouraging the TUC and trade unions to get involved in this agenda. And actually Union Learn, which is a very effective part of the TUC, has just set up a new project looking at how trade unions can be part of developing high-performance workplaces, which of course is part of the whole engagement agenda. So I mean, I feel very strongly. I worked for Unison for 10 years. I think unions have got a vital role to play in this. And what's very interesting is that those unions who tended to be supportive of a partnership approach, which would include Prospect, which would include USDA, which would certainly include the unions in the health service, where there is still a very strong partnership relationship, tend to also be those unions who on the ground, play a very positive role with engagement, and I think we need more of it.
Okay, thank you very much. Further questions? A gentleman here in the aisle with his sunglasses on his head.
When you look at the larger organisations like DWP and HMRC, typically they have a really dispersed setup with a large number of low-grade people in comparison to, say, Cabinet Office or Treasury, and there's a high correlation between engagement and grade when you do the more complex analysis on this. I'd heard that private sector organisations change the question to larger organisations so that they focus on their part of the organisation. So like for HMRC, you wouldn't just ask it for HMRC as a whole. You might take it just for a contact centre or a low-level organisation. And I think that's one of the few weaknesses. I think it's a really good idea to have this people survey, but I think it sort of breaks down at the edges a bit. And I wonder if you are considering doing something more subtle about those sorts of issues.
I'm going to ask Liz and Sue for a perspective on that. Liz?
I think that's a really interesting question. What I find when we look at HMRC's results or DWP's results is that there's actually greater variation within those organisations, and there are between the organisations, which means that even with the question set we have, some people are scoring, some areas of the organisation are scoring much higher than others. And it's not always the case that those are the bits in the corporate centre or whatever. There's bits of the operational areas that are doing very similar jobs to other bits who are getting much higher engagement scores. And I think that's when the value of the survey can really come in, because what is operational area A doing that's so different from operational area B is that they're getting much higher scores. But in answer of, are we specifically looking at what I think you're terming as kind of job engagement rather than organisational engagement? Some organisations in the survey did, as part of the optional extra questions they can ask, did begin to ask some questions like that to test that. And we'll continue to look at how the survey should evolve, and it'll be interesting to take a look at how those questions are answered. So we're by no means sort of ruling out looking at different approaches like that, but I think there's still an awful lot of value you can get from looking at the results of a large organisation, going beneath the surface and seeing how small parts of it are doing really well and whether there's some lessons that can be applied to the rest of the organisation there.
Sue?
We don't, we use a survey consistently across the organisation, but we're able to cut it by P&L because we've got lots of businesses within businesses. And that creates a lot of kind of energy and noise because the businesses get very competitive, so they focus in on the number on the scorecard. What we have been doing, though, is following up the wide-ranging survey with some targeted questions, looking at kind of segmenting groups. So we would look at more senior people, see whether they're more or less engaged. Interestingly, our senior people probably are less engaged or are potentially thinking about leaving the organisation more than more junior people. And that may be because senior people are kind of constantly in touch with headhunters. That's our view of the world. But if you look at the demographics around Generation Y, for etc., I think this is where you can use the survey in a sophisticated way to think about what your strategies could be for those differentiated groups. So we use a blanket approach, but then we dig underneath it with some targeted questions.
Okay, thank you. Further questions? Gentleman down here.
With so much government work being done in projects now, how do you maximise staff engagement where staff may be working in several different projects at one time and therefore not have such strong bonds with individual managers or with their teams?
David or Nita, have you come across this?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and it's one that addresses not only the public sector but the private sector as well. When businesses went global, people found themselves with a line to their region, a line to the business they're in, and a line to the function they're in. So they end up with 3 different lines. And the thing that binds this all together is, I presume even in the projects you're referring to, they're in a context and people are reminded what success for the whole context is. So our bit of it, our project, has a role to play in the bigger purpose of what we're doing. And I think it's important that that bigger purpose is understood within the project team. And then the second thing, if people are forming and unforming, when they come together, don't start straight off with a Gantt chart. That's what we were told. We set this task force up, weren't we? For God's sake, don't start with a Gantt chart. Start with what success would look like, why we're here, why is our energy, what would be fantastic, what would be, to carry on with our boiler moment, what's the thing that we're really looking for. Don't pass that moment at the beginning of setting a project up. Really get in touch with what this is about and then start to say, well, the KPIs of success and the things we need to do by dates and so on, then get that up. So if you're forming and unforming, don't take it as read that people know why they're there. Remind them of the big context and remind them of what, and get them to remind you all collectively what success would look like within the project, and then start to do the actions would be a thought.
Okay. I think we've got time for one more question, if there is one more question in the auditorium. See a gentleman down here with a striped tie.
Hi, Peter Buster from DWP. I'm the head of the DWP Central Lean Unit. DWP have been running a very successful program of lean continuous improvement for the last 4 years. And latterly, we've been working across government with Cabinet Office and have just agreed a cross-government continuous improvement strategy. Lean continuous improvement puts frontline staff at the heart of driving continuous improvement bottom-up, as well as obviously putting the customer there too. Just no mention of it today within the context of this session. And I was just wondering to what extent it is on the radar for the task force going forward.
Gus?
Sure. I'm glad you mentioned the continuous improvement program. It's a fantastic program, and it's, if you like, one of the lean is one part of continuous improvement, as you well know, and I've seen it operating in various places, Newcastle and the like. It is massively important. I think it's the two things are very related in that what we're doing with engagement, at least the only measurement we've got is these annual surveys and maybe some pulse surveys that individual departments are taking. But continuous improvement is, if you like, engaging with staff every single day. Because if you go and into an operation where they're, let's say, doing lean, and you stand there talking to staff about how they're analysing their own performance, how they're looking at the performance of the contact centre or whatever, how their engagement with the public is working, the things that, the obstacles, the things they're trying to remove, how they're managing over sickness absence and all those sorts of things. You get a staff that is very engaged day to day, and they are thinking about continuous improvement. And to be honest, that's the world we have to be in. That's, you know, globalization. Someone mentioned the M. Davis stuff. You know, this is a competitive world. We need to be getting better at the things we're doing all the time. Our public demand it. They expect better services. Private sector's giving us better and better mobile phones, God help us. We need to get better and better services for the public, and that's what they demand. So continuous improvement is absolutely essential. You engage people every single day. We can take a look at how that engagement's going, and the two things should be a very good feedback loop on each other.
Okay, excellent. Well, we've come up on 4 o'clock, so that's the conclusion of the session. For me, employee engagement is an incredibly important subject, and I think the thing that's mostly encouraging for me is the degree of firepower, in a sense, that we have, both at the top of the civil service and with David and Nita, and also people prepared to come in and comment from the outside. So I'd like to thank David and Nita and Sue and Liz and Gus, and thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much indeed.